Thank you so much, Professor Esther. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you, Verena, for this opportunity to be able to speak with us this afternoon or this evening. Greetings to everyone that is here. I'm glad to see familiar faces and also to see faces that I'm probably seeing for the first time, faces and names. But thank you for this opportunity. This afternoon, I would like us to critically examine how theological education in Africa intersects with gender justice. So the conversation today is around gender justice and theological education in Africa. And as I was preparing this, I was thinking to myself, this is a conversation that should have reached a particular stage at this point, but we haven't quite gotten to where we really want to get yet, but we will get there. So as we engage how theological education in Africa intersects with gender justice, we want to be open. We want to be able to think together. We want to be able to brainstorm together at some point and engage with each other through this process. So African women theologians continue to argue for theological programs. Just to say, before I go any further, I did not prepare a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to speak with us, read my notes, and then get into conversation at some point, I hope. So as I was saying, African women theologians continue to argue for theological programs that explicitly combat patriarchal structures and encourage mutual partnerships between genders, challenging oppressive narratives and promoting liberation for all. So like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, this African women theologians call for leaving no one behind. Yet, we constantly see women being left behind. At times, women who have the same or even more qualifications than their male counterparts, and yet cannot find positions in theological institutions of higher education or even, ordination in churches. Theological education plays a very critical role, not only in preparing individuals for ministry and academia, but also in equipping professionals for service in non-governmental organizations and faith-based organizations. So within all of these spaces, whether ecclesial, academic, or civic spaces, gender dynamics must be considered as central to the theological education process. The question arises, however, are women equally present and presented in theological education in Africa? And further, are women given equal opportunities to participate and to lead within theological and ministerial spaces? Now, as we know, historically, theological education has not been inclusive of women. And while it is intended for both women and men, theological institutions have often perpetuated structures of injustice and exclusion, particularly against women. In many cases, women have been denied access to ordination, theological training, and leadership roles within churches and within theological institutions. Just a brief about gender justice. Gender justice goes beyond gender equality. It's about fairness. It's about transforming the systems that perpetuate gender-based discrimination into inclusive ones. In Africa, gender justice is shaped by a number of things, multiple layers: colonial legacies, customary laws, economic disparities, patriarchal institutions. This makes the struggle complex, and yet it's not without hope. And in talking about gender justice in Africa, we also note that it's not one size fits all, because Africa, as we are all aware, is not a country, but a continent with 54 countries. And think about it, within those 54 countries, we find diverse communities and clans. In Zambia, for instance, there are about 72 groups. This means that there is a huge diversity of contexts within one country. Now to talk about the entire Africa. So 15 countries with varied languages, varied religions, varied cultures. What works in Tunisia may not work in Malawi. What works in Malawi may not work in Ghana. What works in South Africa may, and so on and so forth. We also are aware that these groups within countries also differ in terms of matrilineal and patrilineal lines. So, as we talk about gender justice, we also note that there's also been colonial, missionary, and post-colonial impact. And since we cannot escape the fact that colonialism impacted the continent in various ways, we also note that colonial powers often entrenched male-dominated legal systems, replacing or co-opting matrilineal or egalitarian customary systems. Now, within the 54 countries in Africa, and however many languages that are there in Africa, there are also lines across patrilineal and matrilineal lines, as I said. So for instance, I'm a Zambian and I come from the Bemba people of Zambia, which is a matrilineal group. And this also meant that among the Bemba people of Zambia, women were the priests of shrines. That is, when we talk about African religious traditions, the women were the priests. And this would mean like women were the pastors in communities. Now, the shift that came with missionaries that were male priests and expected to have men as priests reversed the community, who had to now change from female priests to male priests. So religious leadership changed completely. And while men were the desired gender in Bible schools, women had to fight for a long time before they could access theological education. And sometimes even when they accessed theological education, they could not even be ordained into ministry. Reasons were given. There is also within post-colonial Zambia a number of women priests. And for one, I could talk about Reverend Dr. Peggy Mulambya Kabonde. She was the first female general secretary of the United Church of Zambia. And I'm certain that if we were to sit down with her and talk with her, she would give us a number of challenges that she faced holding that office as a woman, the first woman to hold that office in Zambia. Gender justice must be examined through an intersection of class, race, ethnicity, disability, and many other issues because we are impacted by various issues as women. Gender justice resonates well within African theological frameworks because African theological frameworks are contextual approaches to Christian thought and practice that emphasizes African identity and culture, aiming to make faith relevant to the spiritual and socioeconomic realities of African people. So the key characteristics would include grounding theology in African worldviews and traditions while engaging the influence of scripture, focusing on community, human flourishing, and focusing on liberation. This discourse offers alternatives to Western theological models and contributes unique perspectives to theology. When we talk about gender justice, we are talking about going beyond gender equality to engage discourses on structural power and epistemic inclusion. This means that how the active process of cooperating diverse knowledge systems and perspectives, particularly those of marginalized groups like women, are transformed into knowledge production and decision-making processes. This further means that we have to be intentional in how we engage critically with emerging conversation on decolonizing theology, for instance. Decolonizing theology calls us to examine the challenge the ways in which colonial structures have shaped Christian theology and practice. This therefore involves not only recognizing, but also destabilizing and dismantling the lasting effects of colonialism on religious thought and on religious experience, particularly in formerly colonized regions like Africa. This process often requires reevaluating traditional theological frameworks. It requires recentering marginalized voices and excluded voices and perspectives. It involves engaging with diverse cultural and historical contexts. Further, conversations around women's theological agency are vital for incorporating diverse knowledge into decision-making processes, which means we need to intentionally engage women's capacity to actively participate in theological reflection, to actively participate in theological discourse or debate, and to continue to actively participate in theological practice in order to shape relevant religious beliefs and practices. This involves challenging traditional interpretations. It involves reinterpreting religious texts, and it involves creating spaces for women's voices within religious communities and within theological institutions. It is a framework that is gender justice. It is a framework that recognizes women as active agents in their faith rather than passive recipients of religious doctrine. We also need to focus on transforming institutional norms by intentionally and critically engaging the deeply embedded fundamental values, beliefs, and behaviors within theological institutions to create more just or effective structures and outcomes. In talking about theological education in Africa, I cannot do justice if I did not talk about the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. So the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians was formed in 1989, and it's been 36 years. And Dr. Mercy Odioye saw the need for African women's representation in the global Christian platforms, and she did something about it. She sent emails, looked for emails and sent emails to Bible schools, seminaries, and universities asking for female students whom she invited to the formation of the circle in Ghana in 1989. And the circle has played a critical role in bringing African religious women's voices to the fore. And in that sense, the circle has been transformative and has contributed exponentially to the growth of African women in theological education. And as I said this, as I was writing this down, I just remembered that we are currently awaiting the publication of a volume by the University of South Africa, or UNISA Press, on pioneers of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. So this is a volume that is co-edited by myself, Professor Musa Dube, Linda Naika, Dorcas Juma, Martha Maleke, and Gina Boateng. We looked at the women who were present at the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians inauguration in 1989 in a Sankofa moment to bring the pioneers of the circle and to write short biographies about each one of them. And the document that had the recorded names, it had 70 recorded names. We are aware that there were more than those women present at the inauguration, but these were documented ones, and those are the only one we could find. And you can imagine that even with the documented names that we had, we could not find information about certain women, and we had to write poems about them or a prayer or a song about them, because we really needed to name each name of the woman that was present, because their presence led to the inclusion of women in theological education. And so it was important that we write this volume, and we are waiting, hopefully before the end of the year, that it will be published and it will be in our hands. And some of these women pioneered a lot of firsts. And as we were writing these biographies, we noted that they were probably the first woman to go to theological education. They were the only woman in that seminary. They were the first woman to be ordained in their denomination. They were the first woman to maybe get a master's or doctorate from a particular university in the West. And they continued to pioneer, to be first in so many capacities. So the circle has contributed largely to doing theology in communities, looking for research approaches and methodologies within African cultures. For instance, Musimbi Kanyolo proposed African feminist cultural hermeneutics, for instance, where we leverage life-giving or positive aspects of our African cultures and we reject the negative or life-denying aspects of our culture. We look within our African cultures to look for academic theological approaches, and this is very important within the circle. Mercy Oduyoye has also discussed storytelling as an approach that we can use in our academic circles. She argued, the stories that we tell of our hurts and joys are sacred. Telling them makes us vulnerable, but without sharing them, we cannot build community and solidarity. Our stories are precious paths on which we have walked with God and struggled for a passage to full humanity. They are events through which we have received the blessing of life from the hand of God, end quote. So storytelling, narrative theology, or autoethnography, if you want to call it that, has always been at the core of African women theologians' thinking. This is a critical approach that engages with our Africanness, our African realities. And often, as African women, we theologize through a lens of a certain or a particular aspect of our lived realities. And since the circle was established in 1989, the circle strives to address patriarchy. It wants to address racism and sexism in education, in culture, in religion, and it has produced a number of volumes and continues to mentor women scholars across Africa and the diaspora. Now, I also note that ACTEA is doing well as well by having mentorship programs where young or rising scholars are mentored into scholarly writing and publication. This is what the circle also offers. Mentorship is at the core of theological education. If we are going to put women's voices out there, African women's voices out there, mentorship is critical and should be engaged. This is important because it is through mentorship that we can tell our stories. This is where we can tell our experiences with the church and with theological institutions. A recent publication by Linda Naika, which is 2024, highlights how the circle has driven gender-sensitive curricula reforms and inclusion of African women theologians in academia, and how the circle has fostered intersectional solidarity and nurtured a generation of scholars even amidst enduring patriarchal structures. Circle members have worked collectively to mainstream gender in theological education. Sometimes when I'm invited, for instance, to speak in certain seminaries, I usually ask the students whether they know of any African women theologians or even male African scholars. But it is sad that in most of the seminaries or Bible schools, the answer is no. And I believe there's a need for seminaries and Bible schools in Africa to engage with African scholarship, to research from African perspective and understand gender justice and theological education from an African perspective. And Isabel argues this. The circle promotes the teaching of gender issues in the theological curriculum. This means making gender a concept in theological analysis. A gendered approach to theology refers to exposing the injustices that exist in the church, injustice that exists in culture and injustice that exists in the Bible in the relationship between men and women. And in acknowledging that human beings construct culture, therefore, cultural practices in the Bible and in our own cultures should not be confused with the will of God. Gender highlights the importance of acknowledging that both men and women are created in the image of God. The process of change requires an analysis of African worldview and how people's identities are constructed, which is important because, that is the end of the quote from Isabel. This is important because if we are going to engage gender issues, and we are Africans, we do need to contextualize it, and we do need to read it from an African perspective. And we can do that by engaging with African scholars that have gone ahead and have done research that is really critical to our Africanness. And through the voices of African women theologians, theological education expands beyond Western norms. It centers African women's voices, epistemologies, and liberation narratives. So these voices of African women theologians continue to forge theoretical frameworks for African women theologies, leveraging from within African cultures. Now, we should also understand that theological institutions have also structural challenges. These include the underrepresentation of women in senior positions. Even when I say this, I think about 36 years of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologies, and we are still talking about these issues. So there's underrepresentation of African women, of women in senior positions, stemming from cultural expectations and the gendering of disciplinary concepts and methods. These challenges manifest, for instance, as fewer female scholars reaching professorial levels and the lack of inclusion in informal networks, which hinders leadership skill development and publication opportunities. Additionally, restrictive theological interpretations of women's roles and societal expectations about domestic responsibilities further limit female participation and advancement in the field. And as I was reading this, I came across a 2025 survey by Verena, our host, which reveals continued gender inequity in African theological institutions. Verena says that women's representation at faculty and leadership levels floats around 20%, with male favoring hiring and biases visible even in devotional and chapel practices. Verena has shown that in the 51 theological institutions, these being seminaries, Bible schools, and Christian universities in Africa, which she looked at, there is 960 male faculty and there is 285 female faculty. I'm going to say that again. Verena looked at 51 theological institutions, being seminaries, Bible schools, and Christian universities in Africa, 51 of them. And in these 51 theological institutions, there's a representation of male faculty at 960 and the representation of female faculty at 285. The gap is quite humongous. Despite the gains in access to theological education over the past 3 decades, systemic barriers still remain, as you can see. Addressing them requires institutional culture shifts. Addressing these requires equitable hiring and a critical theological praxis, not merely the token of hiring women. These frameworks invites us to rethink theological education beyond textual delivery, embedding relationality, ecology, and justice in curriculum design and practice. This is important for us to get to a place where we are going to talk about gender justice in theological education. And in talking about theological education, I was brought to the thought and to the idea that Professor Messi Odioye brought, the concept of the one-winged theology. The one-winged theology, this was a conversation that Professor Odioye had in 1989 at the SECO inauguration. You would think that 36 years later, we should be talking about a two-winged theology. But we are still here. A one-winged theology is a powerful metaphor that Prof. Odioye used to critique mainstream Christian theology, particularly male-dominated traditions, for being incomplete and imbalanced because it largely excludes women's experiences. The one-winged theology cannot fly, Odioye argued, just as a bird with one wing cannot fly. A theology that ignores women's perspective is incomplete and can not truly address the full human condition. This means that a theology that does not take into account women, a theology that does not take into account persons with disabilities and other marginalized, excluded, and left out of history groups does not do justice to theological education. And this further means that theological institutions that leave behind women and persons with disabilities for whatever reason is incomplete and is imbalanced. Odioye argues that traditional Christian theology often centers the experiences, voices, and interpretations of Western men, marginalizing or entirely overlooking women, African women in this sense. She emphasizes that African women face multiple layers of oppression, from patriarchy, colonialism, economic hardships, cultural traditions, and these realities must shape theological reflection. They must be engaged within theological reflection. And as I was thinking this, I remember having heard a story of a female pastor who was the first woman to be ordained. That's around 2010. She was the first woman to be ordained in a denomination. And you can imagine that she faced a lot of challenges. She faced a lot of discrimination, a lot of challenges, to the point that she started having a mental breakdown. And as she was slowly developing this mental breakdown, nobody noted that she was going through a tough time until it reached a place where she was naked in the streets. And that is when the male clergy, her colleagues, started saying, this is the reason women should not be ordained. They do not have the spiritual stamina to hold pastoral leadership. And then I was made to think there have been times when male clergy have gone through these kind of things, but it was not said that they did not have the spiritual stamina to hold office, but that they were overloaded, they had too much work, they were stressed, they were depressed. But for a woman, she did not have the stamina for a spiritual office because she was overburdened. And in the same vein, I began to think about, while there is all this downside to theological education and theological institutions and churches, we are grateful for the Africa 6, the Anglican women bishops. We have Bishop Philomena Teta from Angola. We have Bishop Vicentia Kabe from South Africa, but currently the Bishop of Lesotho. We have Bishop Dulcie Dlamini from Eswatini, Bishop Elizabeth Awut from South Sudan, Bishop Rose Okeno from Kenya, and Bishop Emily Onyango from Kenya as well. And while this is a milestone, we should also remember that some churches still don't ordain women clergy. For instance, Zambia, Malawi, and Zimbabwe do not, the Anglican diocese in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi do not ordain women. And so we realize that we can still celebrate these positive milestones because we know that the wheel of change is quite slow in turning, but we still are impacted by the victories that arise, like the Africa 6 bishops. It is also notable to talk about theological education that we have in 2021 in South Africa, Professor Puleng Lenkabula, who was appointed as the first woman principal and vice chancellor of the University of South Africa after 140 years of male leadership. 140 years of male vice chancellors. Professor Puleng Lenkabula was appointed as the first woman. She's not only the first woman, she's also a Black woman. And you can imagine the challenges that she probably encounters in holding this office. We can also mention here that in 1987 to 1994, if I'm not mistaken, Mercy Odioye was the Deputy General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, the position that Professor Isabel Piri also held until 2022. These are positions of influence where women's voices can engage critically and African women's voices get to be heard. And we have a benchmark knowing that even as the wheels of change turn slowly, there is a potential of women getting into decision-making positions. And so theological education impacts both clergy, professors, and highlighting a few that have reached those positions of power points us to a place where we continue to engage in conversations that are about justice and inclusivity of all, thereby engaging in conversations that leave no one behind. And I'm going to stop here so that I can give time for questions and answers, I think. So there's, I think I sent the questions already to Verena for our breakout sessions. Thank you very much.